Hi there, it's Ross from Abundant Gardens, and in this video I want to talk about planting fruit trees and whether or not you need to add a stake. So it's the winter, the perfect time for planting your fruit trees, and I've got to say it's one of my favourite things to do. And is there anything better than planting a fruit tree knowing that in a few years time you're going to be gathering a delicious harvest of fruit? So, what is the best way to care for your fruit tree once you've planted it? So, I have planted a plum tree here, and you'll notice that I've not added a stake. And it's something that I end up talking with people a fair amount about. Obviously if I'm discussing with someone about whether or not they want a fruit tree added into their garden, the general assumption that people have when I'm speaking with them about that is that they need to add a stake and a tie-in to support the tree. And generally speaking, that's not actually the case. And the reason being that when you're getting a fruit tree, you're usually going to be getting, in the winter, ideally you want to be getting a bare root tree. So it comes not in a pot, it comes with the roots exposed, and that's only possible to be done over the winter. If you're planting a fruit tree outside of the winter, then you'll find it will come in a pot, and the bare root season runs roughly from December through until March. Bare root is the best way to get your fruit tree. It's the most economical and usually the most effective in terms of the tree establishing in the best way it can. So you've got your fruit tree, you've planted it, and so do you need to add a stake or not? And as I've said, generally speaking, you don't. And the reason for that is because you want to allow the fruit tree to move. And it's this movement that that movement is in reaction to the tree's environment. So generally speaking, the wind that it's exposed to, and that movement sends signals down into the roots, and it tells the roots, we need to spread out, and we need to make sure that we can support everything that's growing above. And so generally what happens if you add a stake and then you tie the tree to that stake, you reduce the amount of movement, which logically you think that makes sense. I want to support the tree whilst it's establishing. What it does is it sends less signals down to the roots, which then means that as this tree is establishing, it's not going to send out and it's not going to create as great a root system as it can, and then that can lead to the tree falling over, which the tree will probably still continue, but it's not ideal in terms of the tree's health. There are some times that you do need to stake a tree if you have so it's worth pointing out all fruit trees that you get are grafted. And so, simply speaking, grafting is when you have the top fruiting section, and you have the root stock, and those two things are separate. And the reason they're separate is that you know what kind of fruit you want, and you know the size of the tree that you want it to be, so you can control that by grafting. And the graft is bringing those two things together. Generally speaking, for a garden, MM106, which is semi-dwarfing, is really popular. But if you use M9, which is the most dwarfing variety of rootstock, then they will need staking. So the M9 is really good for making cordons, but yeah, they don't develop enough of a root system to be able to withhold the fruit that they develop without a stake. But if you have anything bigger than that, that's going to get bigger than that, then staking isn't necessary. You do find sometimes, though, if you're on a really exposed site, then staking can be helpful. But if you do ever stake a tree, you are only ever staking a tree for its first 3 years. You're just helping that tree to establish for 3 years, and then that stake needs to come out. I find it's not that uncommon for me to come and go into people's gardens and see trees that are nearly fully grown and the stake is still in the ground next to it, and that can lead to problems. It can get in the way, it can cause rubbing, it's just not ideal to leave the stake in next to the tree. So yeah, remember, if you do stake a tree, then it is really only for the first 3 years. Generally speaking, you don't need to, but there is something that you do need to do if you you'd need to do this whether you staked the tree or you didn't stake the tree. But again, for the first 3 years, it's really a good idea to knock the fruit off the tree. So as I was saying earlier, all fruit trees are grafted, which means that they also produce fruit very early on, sometimes from year 2. But generally speaking, they wouldn't do that. If they were to grow from seed, so for an apple, for example, that would probably fruit after 10 years. So you can imagine the tree's grown, it's established itself, and then it's ready to produce fruit. This tree has got very little on it. This is a 1-year-old, and next year it could potentially produce fruit, and it really hasn't got much to support that fruit on it. So yeah, to really help the tree put its energy into developing, producing those roots, for the first 3 years, I would strongly recommend knocking off the fruit. And so what that looks like is you allow the tree to produce its blossom because it's beautiful, and then you allow it to set fruit, so once it's been pollinated. But then once you see the nub forming, so that's the fruit forming, you want to knock that off as early as you can, because you want the tree to put the least amount of energy into producing that bit of fruit, and you want it to put all of its energy into developing its roots and becoming strong and healthy. So there you go. If you're thinking about planting a fruit tree this winter, then consider whether or not you need to add in a stake. Chances are you don't. But yeah, there are a couple of circumstances that you do, and that is whether you're using an M9 rootstock, so that real dwarfing variety, or if you're on a really exposed site. But remember, you need to keep an eye on that stake, and you're going to remove it after 3 years. And then, regardless of whether you've staked your tree or not, remember to knock off those fruits for the first 3 years, and then fingers crossed you should have happy, healthy and delicious trees to gather harvests from year after year after year. And so there we go. I hope you found that video helpful, and if you have, I do really appreciate it when you hit that like button. And if you do like videos about gardening, nature connection and wildlife, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can get all the kind of content that you like coming at you. And I'll see you again soon for another video.